It started as just another town hall meeting, a modest community center in Ohio. Foldable chairs arranged in neat rows, the American flag hanging behind a makeshift stage, and a handful of security guards posted casually near the doors. The air buzzed with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional squeak of a styrofoam coffee cup being set down. It was a small event, intimate by Donald Trump's usual standards, but that was the point. This wasn't about rallying thousands in stadiums. This was about reconnecting with voters face to face, answering their questions, showing, at least on the surface, that he was listening. The local news stations had set up their cameras in the back, and a few independent journalists had taken seats near the aisles, their notepads ready. Then he walked in. Trump's presence, as always, altered the atmosphere. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a dark blazer, open-collar shirt, no tie. More casual, almost approachable. He smiled, waved to the crowd, took his spot on stage, and the questions began. At first, they were routine. Taxes, gas prices, border security. Trump answered with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. There were scattered chuckles, polite applause, the kind of low-energy rhythm that comes from political events more scripted than spontaneous, until the kid stood up. He couldn't have been more than 17. Thin frame, baseball cap in his hands, sleeves of his hoodie pushed halfway up his arms. He looked nervous, at first. But then he spoke. "My name is Jacob," he said, his voice steadying after the first syllable. "My dad's in prison, and I believe it's because of you." You could have heard a pin drop. The room fell into a hush as Donald Trump unfolded the letter once more, his eyes scanning the page with a weight that silenced even the noisiest journalists in the back. The cameras, though prohibited from filming, captured the stillness through their lenses. Everyone expected another political soundbite, another media moment. But Trump's voice, when it finally came, was low, steady, and entirely unlike the bombast the country had grown used to. This came from a kid named Tyler," he said, holding the crumpled envelope up slightly. "He's 11, lives in Nebraska. His family's farm has been in trouble since the floods last year. They've tried everything, loans, cutting back, selling equipment. But now the bank's giving them 30 days before foreclosure." He looked up at the room, his tone oddly subdued. "He wrote me because he thought I could fix it." A pause. "He didn't ask for money, not once. He asked me to talk to someone, anyone. Said if we just heard their story, maybe someone would care enough to help." There was no laughter, no interruptions, just silence. "I get thousands of letters," Trump continued, his voice thickening just slightly. "But this one, I couldn't shake it. Not because it's sad. God knows there are too many sad letters. But because this kid wrote it like he still believed in something." He folded the letter carefully and placed it back into his inner pocket like it was a classified document. "That kind of hope," he muttered. "That's rare." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't declare war on anyone. But the weight of his words landed like a slow-moving freight train. No one saw what was coming next. But Trump had already made a call before stepping onto that stage, and the ripples had already started. By the time Air Force One touched down in Omaha the next morning, the internet had already exploded. News outlets ran headlines like, "Trump moved by letter from 11-year-old farmer's son," and the boy's name, Tyler Monroe, was trending nationwide. But while the media scrambled to frame the narrative, Trump wasn't waiting for spin. He was already en route to the farm. No fanfare, no rally, just a black SUV convoy rolling down a narrow gravel road, cutting through endless fields of brittle corn stalks. The farmhouse looked tired, paint peeling, porch sagging, the kind of place that told 100 silent stories without a single word. Tyler stood out front in oversized boots, his mother beside him, trying to hold back tears. And then Trump stepped out of the car. He didn't wave to cameras. There weren't any. This wasn't a photo op. It was just him, walking straight to the boy like they'd known each other forever. "You wrote a hell of a letter," he said, bending slightly to meet Tyler's eye level. The boy smiled nervously. "Did you really read the whole thing?" Twice, Trump replied. And then I made a few calls. What happened next felt like something out of a political fantasy novel. The president of a major agricultural lender pulled into the driveway, then a USDA regional director, then a man from the state's emergency relief program. They hadn't been told why they were coming, only that the president had asked them to meet him now. And now, here they were, standing on cracked concrete, in front of a boy who'd written a letter from his kitchen table. Trump turned to them, his tone shifting from soft to steel. "This family isn't just a case number," he said. "This kid's letter reminded me what we're supposed to be doing, not checking boxes, not pushing papers, fixing things. So, what are you going to do?" The officials looked at each other, no script, no time to prepare. Just a moment, and the eyes of a president who wasn't asking for permission. This wasn't policy anymore. It was personal. By the time Trump's boots hit the edge of the Monroe family's broken porch, the moment had already started to ripple far beyond Nebraska. A single tweet from a local radio reporter, "Trump visits farm after boy's letter goes viral," was enough to crack the internet's shell. Within an hour, conservative influencers were reposting the photo of Tyler and the former president shaking hands. But the real storm hadn't even started yet. Back inside the Monroe kitchen, Trump pulled out a worn chair and sat at the family's small table like he'd done it 1,000 times before. No speeches, no press, just a man listening. He asked about crop prices, taxes, how long it had been since they got a fair deal from the grain elevators. Tyler's mom explained how her husband had passed the year before and how they'd been holding on by threads. You could see it in Trump's face. This wasn't just a campaign stop. This was real. Outside, the officials were on phones, making calls they weren't supposed to make without clearance. Trump had said one sentence that changed everything. "I don't want a promise. I want a solution before I leave this place." An hour later, it started. The USDA rep stepped inside and said, "There's an emergency relief clause we can invoke. We'll start the paperwork today." Then the bank rep added, "I can restructure their debt, 12 months no payments, no foreclosure." Tyler looked at his mom. She broke. Years of tension, fear, and quiet desperation finally melted in that kitchen. Trump stood. "Good," he said. "Now let's make sure no other family has to beg for this." He walked out the front door, back toward the gravel road, but he didn't get far. Cameras had finally arrived. National media trucks were lined up outside the farm gate. Someone had leaked it. But for once, Trump didn't wave them off. He turned to face them. "You want a quote?" he said, his voice booming across the wind. "This country was built on families like the Monroes. It's time we start acting like it." That soundbite hit cable news before he even reached the car. Within 24 hours, it would spark something nobody saw coming. By the next morning, the story wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Every major news outlet, from Fox to MSNBC, had looped the same 12-second clip. Trump walking off a Nebraska farm, turning to the cameras, and declaring, "It's time we start acting like it." But what stunned producers wasn't the quote, it was the reaction. It wasn't red states or blue states. It was everyone. In Kansas, a widow who hadn't spoken in a town hall meeting in 20 years stood up and said, "We need help too." In Georgia, a local pastor rewrote his Sunday sermon around the idea of politics that listens. Across coffee shops in rural Ohio, farmers were comparing their debts, their stories, their survival. For the first time in a long time, they felt seen. Online, the clip triggered what analysts called the Tyler wave, a cascade of videos from everyday Americans sharing their struggles. Small business owners, factory workers, single parents. Not asking for handouts, but asking to be heard. The hashtag #ChuckListenToTyler exploded on every platform. Back in D.C., the reaction was less heartwarming. Trump's unannounced visit had blindsided both parties. The administration scrambled to frame it as reckless. Pundits argued it was a stunt, but deep down everyone knew something had shifted. You could see it in the polls, but more than that, you could feel it in the air. When a popular host on a late-night comedy show mocked the visit, The crowd didn't laugh. That silence said more than any applause ever could. Trump, meanwhile, hadn't said a word since Nebraska. No press conference, no social post, nothing, because he didn't have to. The image of a boy handing a folded letter to a man who still wore his coat inside the house. It was enough. And while D.C. bickered, the next domino was already falling. A retired dairy farmer in Pennsylvania had just written a letter of his own. This time he wasn't asking for help. He was offering land. 3 days later, something no one expected happened. A package arrived at the White House. No return address, just a faded envelope sealed with old-fashioned red wax. Inside, a handwritten letter, penned in neat cursive, signed simply, William T., retired farmer, Lancaster County. The message wasn't long. It didn't beg or accuse. It offered. You stood up for one of us, Mr. President. I've got 20 acres I'm not using anymore. If it can help someone keep their family afloat, it's yours. The letter wasn't leaked. It was published, on purpose, by Trump's team. And it detonated. Within 48 hours, over 2,000 similar letters flooded in from across the country. Some offered land, others equipment. Some just shared stories of survival, of heartbreak, of silent pride. But the message was always the same. If you're finally going to fight for us, we're standing with you. And suddenly, what started as a quiet act of compassion in a muddy Nebraska field had become something else. A movement. The media didn't know what to do with it. This wasn't policy. It wasn't a rally. It wasn't even political in the traditional sense. It was human. In Washington, advisors urged Trump to pivot, capitalize on the moment, stage a press tour. But he refused. This isn't about me, he told them. It's about them. Let them speak. So instead, he sent one man, a field coordinator, not a senator, not a celebrity, just a guy with a clipboard and a pickup truck. His mission, drive from town to town, listen and report back. And when he showed up in Iowa, the farmers were already waiting, with coffee and chairs and more letters. The fire was spreading, and no one, not even Trump, could predict where it would burn next. The fire had started in a Nebraska barn. Now it was spreading to newsrooms in New York. By the end of the week, major networks couldn't ignore it anymore. The headline read, Trump responds to farmer's letter, receives thousands more in return. But what caught everyone off guard wasn't the quantity, it was the tone. These weren't angry, polarized rants. They were stories, human, raw, unfiltered stories, of land passed down through generations, of banks foreclosing on dreams, of fathers working double shifts while daughters filled out scholarship forms they knew would get denied. Suddenly, the farmer wasn't just a man from Nebraska. He was every man who had ever felt invisible. And Trump, by simply listening, had become the one person who made them feel seen. The media scrambled for a narrative. Was this populism, nostalgia, a campaign stunt? But none of the usual talking points landed. Because this time, there was no podium, no cameras, just a former president sitting alone at a desk, reading every single letter and writing back. Yes. Handwriting replies. His team begged him to stop. This isn't scalable, one advisor warned. He didn't care. They spent hours writing these, he said. They deserve 5 minutes of mine. Opposition voices started to panic. Columnists wrote op-eds accusing him of emotional manipulation. Late-night hosts made jokes. A senator from Vermont even called it performance empathy. But none of that mattered, because in a town hall in Ohio, a single mom stood up and held up her letter. He wrote me back, she said, voice trembling. He didn't promise anything. He just said, I hear you. That's the first time in my life someone in Washington said that to me. The room fell silent, and the silence said everything. It started with a shift in body language. Senators who once rolled their eyes at anything Trump-related now glanced over briefing folders with furrowed brows. Staffers who used to mute the name Donald on social media quietly reopened their feeds. Something was happening, and no one could quite define it, yet everyone felt it. On Capitol Hill, aides whispered about the letter wave. One congressman from Texas, once a vocal Trump critic, stood in a committee meeting and said, "I don't care who you voted for. If you're not reading what these people are writing, then you're not doing your job." The room went still because they were reading them, across party lines, across ideological divides. Even the president, who had maintained an icy silence about the entire movement, was briefed on it during a closed-door Oval Office meeting. "He's responding to farmers?" the president asked, squinting at the reports. "No, sir," an aide replied. "He's responding to America." Meanwhile, in rural town halls and church basements, people were gathering not for rallies, but for readings. Volunteers would pass around copies of Trump's handwritten replies, and someone would stand at the front and read them aloud, like scripture. One letter read, "You said you didn't think your voice mattered anymore. I'm telling you it does. Never let them convince you otherwise." It wasn't policy. It wasn't a campaign. It was a connection, and it scared the establishment more than any campaign ever had. Back in Washington, lobbyists scrambled. Pollsters scrambled harder. Why? Because the numbers didn't make sense. Trump's favorability hadn't skyrocketed overnight, but something deeper was shifting. The trust gap was closing, not with slogans, not with rallies, with ink. On paper, late-night strategists started to panic. "What do we do with this?" one asked aloud in a campaign war room. The answer came from a young staffer in the corner. "Nothing." The room turned. "That's the problem," she said. "You can't fight something like this with ads. You can't cancel a handwritten note. People aren't watching him. They're feeling him." And that was the moment it became clear. This wasn't about Trump. It was about people rediscovering their own worth through the eyes of someone they thought had forgotten them. And that, my friend, is more powerful than any speech, any platform, or any election promise. Because you can debate politics all day long, but you can't debate how it feels to finally be heard. The storm didn't hit like a lightning strike. It arrived slowly, quietly, as if it had always been there, just waiting for the right time to be noticed. And when it finally rolled across the American consciousness, it didn't look like outrage or protest or televised chaos. It looked like a folded piece of paper passed from one calloused hand to another with a signature that said not just Donald J. Trump, but "I heard you." The movement wasn't about winning votes. It wasn't about headlines or likes or viral moments. It was about something dangerously rare in modern politics, intimacy. And the intimacy wasn't grand. It was humble. A note written at 2 a.m. by a man no longer in office but still burdened with the voices of people who had no microphone of their own. One morning, in a small Ohio diner with linoleum floors and flickering lights, an elderly woman pulled a letter from her purse and handed it to the waitress, her hands shaking slightly. Not from age, but from reverence. "Read this," she said quietly. "He wrote it to my husband, after the flood took everything." The waitress, barely 20, read the words slowly until she stopped. Her lips trembled. "He signed it by hand?" she whispered. "He did," the woman nodded, "and he remembered our dog's name." It wasn't just the content of the letters. It was the precision, the humanity, the fact that someone had taken time, not as a politician, but as a person to say, "You matter." And in a world constantly screaming for attention, someone simply listening felt revolutionary. News anchors tried to catch up. Cable segments debated whether the Trump letters were a publicity stunt, a soft re-entry into politics, or perhaps a carefully engineered PR maneuver. But none of them had spoken to the mother who had read her daughter's letter aloud during chemotherapy, or the disabled veteran who kept his reply laminated inside his Bible, or the trucker who hung his in the cab, right above the mirror, next to a photo of his late father. They hadn't felt what the people felt, because something had shifted, not in politics, but in people. They weren't just angry anymore. They were aware of their place, their power, and most dangerously for the establishment, their worth. And in Washington, they could feel it too. In closed rooms, they whispered about how the temperature was changing, not louder but heavier, like the air before a storm. Then came the hearing. Congressional oversight, an ordinary session, until someone, a junior representative, brought up the letters. Not in a combative way, just a mention, an anecdote, about how a constituent had broken down in tears after reading Trump's response to her foreclosure letter. The room fell silent, not from offense, but from recognition. Because even those who had opposed Trump couldn't deny what had happened. A man, once labeled brash, polarizing, reckless, had reached into the quiet places of American life and answered not with noise, but with stillness. And when he finally did speak again, not on TV, not on stage, but through a published compilation of selected letters titled, "To Those Who Wrote Me," it sold out in hours, not because of Trump, because of them, the farmers, the single mothers, the veterans, the forgotten. In the final pages, one line stood out. It wasn't political, it wasn't poetic, it was just true. "You wrote to me when no one else would listen. I'm writing back because no one else should have to." And that was it. That was the pivot. Not to a campaign, not to power. To something harder to define, and harder to destroy. To a bond. Because long after the elections fade, the speeches end, and the podiums go silent, the words on paper remain. And sometimes, the quietest replies echo the loudest.